So graphic design is made up of elements of design. You will be utilizing these every single time you design. But they consist of line, value, form, color, shape, texture, and space. Lines, they're just, connecting points to each other. But lines aren't just single lines that you may use to break up text. Lines can also be found in typography. So fonts, if you hear the word typography, that is just the manipulation of fonts. So when you look at fonts, even if you look at this actual page itself, the word elements, that's made up of lines. All of those letters are made up of lines. That is, you can find lines in a lot of different areas of design, and you need to make sure that you're aware of them and using them well. Value is the apparent lightness or darkness of something. So if something, I would say, kind of goes into contrast of if you think about maybe typography, text against a background. Look at this example here, right? Elements of design. It has good contrast because there's a dark value to the text, there's a light value to the background, and literally it's black and white. So the black can easily be read against that white background. So when we're talking about value, we want to make sure that we're aware of how much light and dark is in specific elements to know how to put them up against certain backgrounds. Form is just giving something depth, is just taking a flat image or a flat graphic and making it three-dimensional. You could do that by adding some shadow to it, by adding sides to it. We see here, right, we had line that created a square, but then we added some sides to it and changed up the value of those sides, meaning we added a little bit more black to that one gray side and a little bit more white to the top, to give it the illusion of depth, so that it has a form now. It's a form rather than a flat shape, which we'll go over in a second. And then there's color. We know what colors are. Colors are the rainbow, but it's important to know how colors work with each other. When it comes to color, we always want to make sure the colors that we choose enhance the message that is being communicated and not taking away from it or distracting from it. So when we do choose color, we want to make sure, especially if we're choosing color for a background and for the typography that's going to sit against that background. We always want to make sure there's good contrast. We always want to put light against dark or dark against light. And we never want light against light or dark against dark, because that's going to be hard to read. Because ultimately, we want to make sure our designs are easy to read and easy to understand. When you are choosing color, you can definitely choose whatever colors you want. You just need to make sure that they work with each other. A lot of times when you look at different designs, if you were to like just do a little bit of research on different graphic design projects, you'll see that there is a trend of picking colors that are the same temperature. So cool colors versus warm colors. Cool colors are your blues, your purples, your greens. Warm colors are your reds, your orange, and your yellows, right? We're sticking to kind of one side of those areas and just choosing colors from that temperature. Also, if you were to look at a color wheel, you'll notice that there are colors next to each other. There are complementary colors. They complement each other. If a color is across from each other on a color wheel, they clash, so they don't go well with each other. So you want to somewhat stay away from those color schemes. For the most part, you want to try to use color appropriately, but you don't want color to take the center stage. You want the message you're trying to communicate to take center stage. So keep that in mind when you are choosing color, and we'll go over color more as the weeks go on. Then there's shape, right? We know what shapes are: organic shapes. Then there are geometric shapes like circles and squares and triangles. There's organic shapes that we just make. You just take a pencil and you start drawing around and then close it up. That's a shape. We can obviously use shapes within our designs as graphics to create emphasis somewhere, to break up text, add some type of visual element to our designs. But shapes like lines are also found in typography as well. So if you look at the example, right, elements of design, those are made up of shapes. They're made up of think about the lines that are being created, right? These are just made up of shapes. So typography is made up of shapes and lines to create letters, to create words. So you can find shapes in a lot of different things. So you should be aware of where those shapes are. Texture is the overall appearance of a physical quality to something. So we can use texture if we want it to be rough, we might use brick. We want to look soft, we might use something silky. It doesn't actually feel that way because it's just the appearance that it has texture. Because you can't, you touch your screen, it's just going to feel like a screen. You touch a piece of paper, it's just going to feel like a piece of paper. Make our viewers believe that it would have a physical texture to it by what we use for our backgrounds, what imagery we use, and what type fonts that we use. What's important to know about texture is that you don't want to overdo it with texture. Texture can actually, when you do it too much, so if you have texture in your background and you have a textured image and you have a textured font, it's overwhelming. That's too much texture. You always want to make sure that you use it sparingly. So if you decide to use texture somewhere, pick a place, use it just there, and don't replicate it. Don't use it too many times because that can be overwhelming. And as you move forward and design more and more, you'll understand when it's best and how to properly use texture. It's definitely a strength. I always say design is a muscle. You have to strengthen it. So you guys are working out right now. You guys are every class that you take is a exercise to build your muscle in design. So as you work through this, you'll be able to say, okay, good. I know where to use texture and how to use it where it's not overwhelming. But for now, if you do use texture, use it very sparingly, maybe just the background, and then that's it. And then there's space. Now I'm highlighting space for you guys right now because you'll hear space a lot from me, but also space isn't just an element of design, but it's also a principle of design. So when we talk about space, it's the area that an element takes up and the area between other elements. So it's everything. There's both negative and positive space. Negative space is the space around an object or an element. Positive space is the space an element takes up. If you look at me, all the space around me, this is all negative space. All around me, it's all negative space. Me, myself, right? My silhouette, me, myself, that's all positive space. So you want to be aware of how close your elements are to each other. Is there enough negative space around each one of your elements between the title and the graphic and the paragraphs? Is there enough space between them? Is there enough space? How much space does that element take up so that you know how to properly balance out your design. So you don't put all the stuff at the top and leave the bottom empty, right? Okay, all this heavy stuff, let me distribute it evenly across the page in order to have some balance in my design. So space is important. And again, it's important. I keep going backwards. It's important because it shows up twice. It's not just an element of design, but it's also a principle of design. And those principle of designs are known as the House principles. They're referred to as the House principles. And House, HAUS, stands for hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. So when you are designing, you will always be designing with the elements we just mentioned. And you will also be trying to design those elements by utilizing hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. If you are hitting each one of these areas in your design, you're going to be designing well. It will be a well-designed piece. The flyer will make sense. It will look good and you'll be able to communicate the message. The business card will look good and you'll be communicating the message clearly, right? So anything you design will be well designed if you are applying the principles of design, which are House principles. Again, they stand for hierarchy, alignment, unity, and space. Let's get into each one of these. Hierarchy, also known as visual hierarchy. This is basically the way you place elements on the page to show their importance. So it guides the eye on the page, where you're placing the title, where you're placing the logo, and any other physical characteristics you're applying to them will determine their importance. So you are organizing in order of importance. This is a really great example. I love this example that I have here on the right, because it shows that you can show visual hierarchy by size, value, so light and dark, right? Color, space, placement, and any other graphical elements that you want to use. You can show hierarchy. For this example, we can clearly see that the visual hierarchy has been placed on this title, which literally says, you will read this first. And you will read that first because of the visual hierarchy that's been placed on it. So it's the size, it's the largest thing on the page. The weight of the text, this is a bold text. The color, you is slightly different. So it tells you that's where I need to start because that's the most important place to start. And from there, because of the size and weight of the rest of the text, you're continually reading that area. Because the next line you're reading, and then you will read this line next, is again, it's a bolder font, it's thick, the weight is thick. The color, right? The color is slightly different, right, from both the background and the text above it and below it. But notice that while it has visual hierarchy, it doesn't have the most. Even though it's large, it's not the largest thing on the page. There's contrast between what the most important thing is and what the next important things are. So when you are trying to apply visual hierarchy, you really do need to take a step back and say, okay, what's the most important thing on the page? Let me make that the biggest, or let me place the most hierarchy, because size isn't just the only way to show hierarchy. You can do color and placement and weight, value, things like that. To add a visual hierarchy. So really you need to look at all the elements on the page that you're going to be using. You might use a title, a date, a logo, some paragraph text, maybe a pull quote. You're looking at all these things, maybe some contact information, social media icons, images, all this stuff. It's a puzzle piece and you need to bring it together somehow to work with each other. Start by saying, what's the most important thing that I need to showcase on my design? Is the title? All right, I will add that. I will make sure that has the most visual hierarchy. What's the next most important thing? Probably the logo. Okay, where I place that and also the size of it, I'll make sure that it's in relation to the title. It's not as big, but you can still tell that it's super important based on where I'm placing it and the size, right? So visual hierarchy really tells the viewer what the most important thing on their page is. It also helps to guide their eye through the page so they know where to look next. And again, this is a great example because you start with, you will read this first. Your eyes automatically go to, then you will read this line next. And then it'll go to, you'll probably read this before the paragraph. All of that is because of the placement, the size, the color, and the weight, and even some graphical elements because of that line. All of that show that all of those areas have visual hierarchy being placed there, which helps you to know where to look and where to look next after that. And it also tells you what the most important information is on the page, so that if you're not interested in reading the paragraph, at least you got something from this design. Some message was communicated with you, even if you didn't necessarily read the whole entire paragraph. Keep going backwards. All right. So when it comes to visual hierarchy, there are three other graphic design terms that you might hear. I've even said these already: emphasis, scale, contrast. These definitely relate back to hierarchy and visual hierarchy, but you might hear them just in general. These are just some terms to keep in mind as you're designing. Emphasis is, it's the purpose is to create something on that will stand out from the rest of the page. You're drawing the eye to a specific location on the page, to a specific thing on the page, and you want to emphasize it. So to do that, you might, again, visual hierarchy, you might change the color of it, you might change the weight of it, you might change the size of it, right? Excuse me. Even in this design, this presentation, the lecture, right? I'm drawing emphasis to these words because I've created them slightly bigger in all caps, and I've also upped the weight of the text. They're bold. So I'm emphasizing these specific words. And I'm emphasizing emphasis. I'm emphasizing scale. I'm emphasizing contrast because of the way I'm displaying them. I'm emphasizing them. And that's to kind of show visual hierarchy so you know where to look first and what the most important information is. Scale. Scale helps you, it shows the importance of something based on how big it is or even how small it is. I think a lot of times we think, oh, it's important, so let me make it really big. That's not the case. You don't necessarily have to make things big. It really goes back into contrast, which is this third word here, is where it's showing a variation between all the elements to make something stand out. You can vary that those characteristics by size, right? By color, by texture, by shape. So they need to be opposite to contrast each other. So again, like light versus dark, they contrast. So if you have a light background with a dark text on it, it's going to contrast really well. It's going to make it easier to read. Scale. If you have something, if all of your text is all the same size, but you have one word in the center that's super tiny, you are drawing emphasis to that word based on scale. You're adding hierarchy to that word based on scale, but not large. Like I think we normally think, I'll just make it really big. No, we can make it super small. It still needs to be readable, legible, but there needs to be a contrast, right? There needs to be enough of a contrast so people know that is meant to be smaller for a reason. I should be reading that, or that's meant to be big for a reason. I should be reading that, right? We want it to be obvious that you are adding contrast to your design to show emphasis, to show visual hierarchy. So all those words definitely go with each other. They definitely help to understand hierarchy, but they can also be used outside of hierarchy as well if you're just trying to show emphasis on something, or we're just talking about scale as a whole, or maybe just color, we're talking about contrast. So these are just terms you will hear as a graphic designer. Moving through the house principles, next up is alignment. This is just the placement of all the elements on a page, how you're placing them. A general rule when you are placing elements on a page is to line them up according to an edge, specifically especially when you're using images and text. You want to align those images along the margins of that text to make sure that everything has clean lines, and also to ensure that there's enough white space between all the different elements on the page. So if you notice this example here, the example on the left it throws you off a little bit. It definitely hurts your brain just a little bit, right? That's because the squares are not aligned properly. They're not aligned along the same edges. They're not centered at all. Or they're not aligned along the right. They're not aligned along the left. They're slightly off, so your brain hurts, right? But the example on the right, everything is lined perfectly, right? Everything is aligned, but they're perfect squares, so they're aligned perfectly centered with each other across each column and along each row. But because they're all perfectly aligned, there's a lot of order. There's a lot of structure to this. You can sit here and look at this at a really long for a really long time and really take in, if there were text in this, you can start really taking in that information in a way that's easy for you, right? It would be easy to read and easy to understand if there's text involved. Right now, there's just shapes to give you an idea of what alignment looks like. But overall, when you are aligning your elements on a page, right, you don't want to just throw things on a page. You want to make sure you're aligning them properly. You're picking to say, okay, my text is aligned left. Let me make sure I align some of these images along that same margin so I can add a lot of consistency and order and ultimately have unity. Unity is that you in house. It's the harmony produced by the elements in the design. The unity really, it doesn't, I think, let me stop. Unity doesn't mean everything needs to be the same. I think that's where we get mixed up. We think, okay, everything needs to be the same size and the same color, the same shape. That's not necessarily the case. Yes, you want to be consistent in some of those choices, but you still want to add variety. So unity and variety. Variety can actually help you create unity because it contrasts with some of the areas that are the same. So the lack of unity would actually make a design feel very cluttered and confusing. So a good rule of thumb is to place an element in your design only if it enhances the message, right? Sometimes, or as graphic designers, you're going to learn how to do a lot of things. You'll know how to do a lot of things. It's important to kind of restrain a little bit and say, okay, no. What actually helps to enhance the message? How can I communicate this message as clearly and efficiently and effectively as possible? Okay, maybe not putting that thing in there. We don't need that. Maybe just focusing on these elements would help. So when it comes to unity, you really just want to put things in there that helps to enhance the message. But that doesn't necessarily mean everything needs to be the same. You can have unity and variety. This is a really great example of that. So the example on the left. So what's unified is the color. So the designer was consistent in the colors that they chose, but showed some variety by changing up the size of all these different circles. So again, there's unity because all the colors the same, but there's variety because all the size is different. Versus the example on the right, the size is all the same, so there's unity there, but it shows variety because of the different colors. So when you are designing, you want to remain consistent in some of your choices. It doesn't have to be everything, but some of them. Some of them, like the typography that you're using. Choose one font, use that one font. Change up the size of it, change up the weight of it. Maybe you want to make the title bold and large, but then the paragraph is just a regular, not bold, and in a smaller size, but it's the same font. Again, unity because it's the same font, variety because it's a different size and weight. So when you are designing, not everything, don't make everything different. That's the thing. Don't make everything different. You want to remain consistent in some of those choices so that your overall design does have unity. Again, you can do this in the typography choices. You can do this in the color choices. So if you've chosen a specific color scheme, you want to repeat that color scheme throughout. If you've chosen a font or two to use, you want to keep using those same two fonts over and over again. You just might change up the size and the weight of that actual font itself just to show some variety. And then when it comes to unity, another really important word to remember, and also principle, even though it's not in the house principles, it's still very important to keep in mind, is balance. So balance is the proper distribution of elements based on visual weight. Um, every element you are working with, whether it's an image, the title, the paragraph, the logo, whatever it is that you're working with within your design, all of it has a visual weight. All of it takes up a certain amount of space, right? We talked about positive versus negative space. That positive space that it's taking up, you want to make sure you're aware of how much space, so that when you're looking at, okay, looking at this page, how can you distribute all of those elements in a way that's as even as possible? Because if you have all the heavy stuff at the top, well, then it's going to be top heavy. If you have everything at the bottom, it's going to be bottom heavy. If you're going to have everything to the right and left, it's going to be heavy on one of those sides. No, you want to make sure you balance that out. So if you're putting the logo, which is usually the logo, which might be very large and take up, has a lot of visual space or visual weight, maybe you put that at the top. Maybe you put the title, right, is right underneath that. Those two things are very heavy in terms of their visual weight. So maybe you want to fill up the rest of the page with the body copy, so the paragraphs, and then maybe you want to add your graphical element, your image, somewhere towards the bottom, right, to balance out the top portion where you have that logo and where you have that title. So it all depends on how you want to place everything. You just want to make sure that you're placing them in a way that creates balance, which would help with the unity. This is a really great example here of symmetrical unity versus asymmetrical unity. Symmetrical balance versus asymmetrical balance. When we're talking about balance, it's really just distributing the weight of every element as evenly as possible. That doesn't mean you have to make everything exact. I put the logo here. I put the title here. That's not the case. It's just more of what makes more sense. Sometimes you look at a design and they put the title at the top, but they put the logo at the bottom. It doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be exactly the same. It just needs to be distributed as evenly as possible. That designer decided the title was the most important thing. They're going to put it at the top, but to balance out the thickness, the size of that title, they put the logo at the bottom. So it really depends on, okay, how do I want to balance out the weight of all these visual elements? You can do it symmetrically where one side does look like another side, or you can do it asymmetrically where one side has certain types of elements and the other side doesn't, but because of the amount of space it takes up, the visual weight that it has, it still feels balanced. If this is confusing, that's okay. You are beginner designers. As you design more and more, you will start understanding balance, and your eye for design will strengthen, and then you'll be able to say, yes, this is how I balance out a design. Obviously, I'm going to be helping you guys with that and all your instructors, but just know everything that we're going over, these are things that you will strengthen along the way, not something I expect you guys to know right now. But I want you to start getting familiar with these terms, with these principles of design, so that when you do start applying them, you're getting more and more confident, but that design, eye for design, is strengthening every single time you place something on a page. and space. We're ending it with space because that is house, right? It ends with the letter S. So space, it is the active and visible distance between, around, above, below, all the elements on a page. Sorry. So if we look at this example here, white space, literally that's what we're talking about, white space. Or I should say this, you'll hear the terms negative space and positive space. You might also hear the term white space. White space is also another term used for negative space. So keep that in mind. If you hear the term white space, they mean negative space. So that's all the space around something. The reason why I don't like using the term white space is because your background isn't always white. Your background could be a different color, and sometimes that can get confusing, especially for newer designers. Of, oh well, it's not white space because my background isn't white. It's like, yes, it is white space. It's still white space regardless. It doesn't matter the color. So I like to use the term negative space. So if you hear me, or if you hear the term white space, it's referring to negative space. But when we look at this graphic, all the right, the actual gray of the letters, right, that is all positive space, right? The actual graphic itself, right, these little brackets, that's positive space. All the space around it, right? All the space around the W and the H, between the letters, the I and the T and the E, all the S, P, A, C, E, all that space between, that is known as negative space. So what we want to do is the space that the element actually takes up. So the space that the W actually takes up, that's positive space. The space that is around each one of these letters, each one of these elements, that's a negative space. We want to be aware of all those things because, again, when things are too close together, they feel cluttered and confusing, and people don't like that and they want to leave. They don't look at that. If it's too far away, it's disconnected. Now we can't relate things to each other. Our eyes are focusing in on the gaps and not on the information, and we're not getting the message that we're supposed to be hearing. That's why space is so important. Practically, too, it's because if you don't have enough space, your object or your design can actually get cut off. So when you are designing and you're placing elements in a page, don't get too close to the very edge of the page, because if it were to get printed, it would get cut off. So when you are placing things on a page, you want to make sure that there's enough space around it, and you want to make sure there's enough space between everything. Again, the space is definitely knowing if something has enough space or too much space. That'll definitely be something you are going to strengthen along the way, the more and more you design.